deze? Ja. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. Welcome to our panel. I think it's going to be a fascinating panel. What constitutes a country? That's what we're going to discuss with you, with our guests here, and I will be your host for tonight. My name is Farid Tabarki, and I'm really glad to be hosting this panel because I get this question every day, which is funny because I'm trying to visit every country in the world, and I visited 145. So therefore, in a conversation, many people ask me, well, what do you think is a country? Because you have to name a number, right? So I'm accustomed to this question. Let's see how we're going to explore this question of what a country is. And we have also a very special project and film in the making, which it narrows down maybe also our question, but also I think is going to be very interesting. Please participate. Welcome to the stream. Harder to participate, but still glad you're joining us for this conversation. Ineke Smits, let's start with you. Filmmaker, transited Dubai, sent by your president. Now you have a film in the making. We're going to see a clip later on. But first this question, what constitutes a country? I define it as 198 countries, something with the UN, etc. But what does this question mean for you?
Hebben we die wel nodig eigenlijk?
Yeah, for the stream.
Well, I started with two things. When I started with this project, I started with, looking around in Rotterdam, at for instance, the Turkish community of third-generation Turkish people who have this choice: are we Turkish, are we Dutch? To see what is now happening in Catalonia, what's happening in Kurds who are fighting. In Syria, but they don't have their own country yet, etc. I mean, it's a very topical question, and this question, I was thinking about this question a lot, but of course it's a very abstract question, and how can you make a film about this question? You have to sort of translate it into something which is cinematographical and a cinema story. So that's why I started to think about where can I do this. And I came up with Abkhazia. I had been there in 1989, first time. And hardly anybody, I think these people know where it is, and you do, but a lot of people don't know. If you say Abkhazia, they have no clue where the hell is Abkhazia. So that was for me very good, because it's just a country. It's just a country that nobody knows. That nobody knows the history. Nobody knows the legal status. Nobody knows who is living there, and
empty canvas almost for
yes,
most people.
Empty canvas. And I wanted to have an empty canvas for this film. So that's how the question, what is a country, and Abkhazia came together. And then of course Abkhazia is very suitable, but maybe we'll get into that later.
We will. Yeah, we're also going to have look at a map later on about Abkhazia, but first let's go to the other guests and see how they relate to this question. Leon Cornelissen, Chief Economist at Robeco. What about you? How do you relate yourself to this question? Where lies your interest?
Well, for an investor, country is very important because it can mean counterparty risk. I mean, you have in charge of a country is a sovereign, and what interests us mostly is it able to repay its debts, and of course, what does Catalonia, for instance, of separatism from Scotland, what does that mean for the creditworthiness of the new entity? So that's why these subjects are interesting for an investor. And also, as an economist, especially in Western Europe, you do not worry too much about borders. I mean, the British are now resurrecting one, which will very detrimental to their own interests. But what I also find very interesting is that the EU once has defined a clear border in the south. So it's very easy to say where where the southern border is of the EU. That's the Mediterranean. As a geographer, you would probably, or an historian, you would probably say the Sahara is a much more suitable border than the Mediterranean. But the EU has firmly declared there won't be. You can't be a member if you're south of the Mediterranean. So that's settled. That's easy. So Morocco will never join the EU. But in the east, of course, you're running into problems because you have then 10 new members. But yeah, is Belarusia, can that be a member? Can Russia be a member? I mean, if you travel to the east, then the first molehill you will see is the Ural. And the geographers are saying, well, that's then the border between Europe and Asia. But of course, that's nonsense. It's artificial. But perhaps all borders are artificial. But in the east, the EU is running into problems, and that's, as such, a fascinating subject.
Okay. Well, all themes we're going to explore. I think also the economical viability of a country and the need for borders from an investor perspective. Very interesting. Marieke de Hoon, our third guest of tonight, assistant professor international law, and also even more relevant maybe, director of PILPG, which is the Public International Law and Policy Group, a pro bono law firm specializing in peace negotiation, post-conflict constitutions, and transitional justice. Already gives away a bit your affinity with the topic, but also maybe for you, what's your perspective on what constitutes a country as a kickoff for our discussion?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me and the invitation. I'm the director of the Netherlands office of PILPG.
The Netherlands office, yeah.
It's a very large organization. That is such an interesting question that I absolutely have no answer to. So we can finish with that, or I can tell you why I have no answer to it. But I think it's really interesting to also immediately hear like the different perspectives to which you can actually look at this question. And so for me as a lawyer, I can see that the way that international law governs this question and national laws already shows very, depending on what type of law and what aspect of the law you look through, you come to different answers that actually maybe or appear very contradictory and lead to opposite answers when you put it on a concrete situation. So that to me is fascinating. So the law won't tell you, oh, look through the law at situation X, and then you'll come to yes or no, very rarely. And then from politics perspective, what constitutes a country, it actually becomes surprisingly simple. Namely, it depends on who recognize you, who are your friends, who is your foes. And so from the law politics intersection, even as a lawyer, when I say in the end what constitutes a country, well, it really depends on what the other countries, what geopolitics wants you to be. So as a lawyer, that of course is a little bit interesting.
Great field. Let's have a discussion on that. Ineke, you already mentioned that your project, your film is going to be about Abkhazia. A clean canvas.
So it's not going to be about Abkhazia, it's going to be filmed in Abkhazia, but it's about what is a country.
Exactly, based in Abkhazia. Let's have a look about where Abkhazia actually is on the map. Maybe that's a good idea.
In the film there will be no maps.
In the film, no maps. That's true. But maybe for our discussion, here we have two pictures. This is the first one. Well, we see the green part, Georgia, and then used to be a part of Georgia, now a country or a self-declared country, Abkhazia.
Careful now.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it is very touchy, and it's going to be streamed. So, who knows what happens? And then we have a second picture, and that's also maybe a nice thing to watch. Ineke, why is it nice to look at this one?
These are all the languages spoken in the Caucasus, and the reason why I also wanted to show this map is that it shows you how diverse and how incredibly complicated the situation is in the Caucasus. You know, it's like I can't remember exactly the amount of languages, but language is one of the things that, you know, one of the one of the qualities
Yeah.
that decides what is a country.
Yeah, yeah.
In some of the theories, because there's many different theories about what a country is.
Yeah, sure. And how could we explore this huge amount of languages? Is it the mountainous region? Is that something to do with it, or?
Yes, it has to do with it's a very mountainous region, and it has, like, sometimes one valley will have a different language from the next valley, and at the same time, because they are like very small entities. I mean, not countries. It used to be like one vast mountain range with different peoples living there. It also tells you something about the character that joins all of those countries or entities. How do you want to call it, actually? Languages. Yeah. They're all different, but they are all Caucasian, and the one thing that puts them together is that they're all different.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the world.
That's right.
And if we zoom into Abkhazia and the languages spoken there, is that one language, or do we already see different languages within Abkhazia itself?
Well, Abkhazia has always been a multicultural society, which makes it one of the reasons why it's very good to make a film about what is a country. Mm-hmm. It has officially the Abkhazian language, but hardly anybody speaks it. You have, I mean, the population, it's very weird, actually. It used to, in the Soviet Union, just very briefly, before I go into all kinds of details, Soviet Union times, 45% was Georgian, and it had 3 languages. Because it was Soviet Union, everybody was speaking Russian. Most of the people were also speaking Georgian. Yep. And there was a small minority that was speaking Abkhazian. At the moment, all the Georgians have been kicked out or killed or fled or whatever. Georgian is forbidden in public, nobody is allowed to speak.
No, by law, Georgian is not a language.
It's not a language, but especially the older generation still speaks Georgian. Yeah. But because nobody speaks Abkhazian, what can you do? So Russian is really the language that most people speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Marike, empty canvas for most people. How empty of a canvas is Abkhazia for you? Do you have any kind of affinity with it, or?
No, I've never been.
No.
Well, my affinity is that I'd love to go.
Okay.
And I'm very interested in the movie.
Yeah.
I've been to a situation where you can't compare any situation, but there are some similarities with Nagorno-Karabakh. Yeah. And I've also done some research on that area. So
it's also on this map between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yes,
yeah.
The conflict zone between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and because I was as an election monitor in Nagorno-Karabakh back in 2010, and then I returned there in 2012. And just because I was there, I'm now persona non grata in Azerbaijan, so that also immediately indicates the sensitivities. So I'm with a picture on the website of the Foreign Ministry of Azerbaijan, and even
You're
more.
Famous.
Wow! Yeah, I know, it's one of my biggest achievements in life. But no, it's so strange, right? Because I was there, and I wasn't there as a political activist, but to them, by just being there, you become a political activist, and it shows how sensitive these situations are. And even it's that weird to me is that even 1 week after I uploaded a new profile pic on LinkedIn, they had already changed the picture on their
They're
MFA.
on top of it. Leon, what's your affinity, if any, with Abkhazia or the other frozen conflicts in the region, Transnistria, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh?
Well, I think one aspect that hasn't been mentioned is that NATO was pushing for membership of Ukraine and Georgia. And I think it's also a sentiment with the population there. And a way to block this from a perspective of the Russian Federation is creating this kind of artificial countries, so Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. So you have basically a Russian entity in a country which for the rest would like to be a NATO member, and the same is in Ukraine. So Eastern Ukraine is also at war, and by this you block any chance of a membership of EU or NATO of Ukraine and Georgia.
Because you can't become a member if you're in a war situation.
Yeah, that's in any case the theory, and probably. I mean, there are also political reasons, of course, why it would probably be a case of imperial overstretch if you would offer NATO membership to Georgia. But you could say by creating facts on the ground, you are now blocking it.
Yeah. Ineke, we're already seeing some pictures. I think you made and somebody else made. You work together with?
Yes, most of the pictures are by me, but the best pictures are by Justina Mielnikovic, who is a Polish photographer with whom I traveled a couple of times there. Coincidentally, she was working on a project at the same time as when I was doing my research.
Yeah. We're also going to look to a clip of or like a test or a tryout clip about the film project that you are starting in April, or the filming.
Yeah,
the
because that's I mean that the film is not there yet, but we did some test shootings to, just to see. I mean, you will see in it just also to test lenses and things. So from this we made a little clip, and that's what you're going to see. And the real film is going to start in April.
Yeah, and before we're going to watch it, maybe it's nice that you also maybe say something about how do you end up in 1989 in Abkhazia at all? What's your affinity with the region as such, and now why it makes sense for you?
That's a very long story,
yeah,
but
so
I will tell
the short
it
version, and then we watched the couple of minutes. But
right,
some nice thing to get to know you and why this film is so relevant.
Yeah, there's some pictures about what I can say, also something, but we'll do that later. No, I ended up there because I was a great fan of Paradjanov's films, who actually came to the Rotterdam Film Festival. For the first time he was allowed to travel outside of the Soviet Union in '88. I was a big fan, and also I had my first film in the EFFR. And I met a Georgian filmmaker who came with him, and that's what brought me to Georgia. And then he took me to Abkhazia, because it was still Soviet Union at that time, and that's how I ended up in Abkhazia, having a Soviet holiday, and not realizing that I would be making this film 20 or 25 years later.
Because this was also the Soviet Riviera almost, right? Like
yes, it was the place where like for instance Stalin had like 6 dachas there, but Gorbachev also had a dacha there. You had all the, from the Soviet times, you had the writer's house, holiday homes, but also for filmmakers, for and workers used to collect when they would be the best worker of a factory, and they would collect their money to go to Abkhazia. Yes, to go to Abkhazia for 1 week. Yeah. That was, like top luxury. So I mean, and that's very sad when you see it. Also, you see it a little bit in the pictures. Is that it used to have like a Kurort style, like beautiful white palaces, and like Riviera-style restaurants and places, and all of that got destroyed in the war, and nothing is done with it. So it's still standing there, and it's
Okay, let's watch the clips. Do you want to say something before you watch the clip?
I can say many things before
I don't know. We can also just have a look.
Let's watch the clip, and then maybe some people have a question about it. Maybe that's easier.
Great. Yeah, let's have a look at the film in the making before it starts.
Жил-был на отдаленном побережье маленький человек с большими идеалами. Он любил свой дом, но видел приближение темных теней.
Working title.
Потом мы пошли в Эльбрус, мы пили там кофе с коньяком. Мы были очень рады, каникулы, лето, вот. И вдруг все начали бегать вокруг. Какое-то движение, вот именно по набережной люди стали бегать. Потом к нам подбежал какой-то мальчик и сказал, что вы здесь сидите, уже война началась. Мы решили, что это шутка. Потом еще какие-то взрывы, какие-то выстрелы. Ну и я сказала, по-моему, это никакая не шутка, а война на самом деле началась.
Он спросил у времени: «Почему ты не видишь то, что вижу я?» Время ответило: «Потому что я не принадлежу тебе, маленький человек. Ты не можешь подбирать себе время, как пару перчаток». «Тогда что же мне делать?» — воскликнул человек. Время сказало: «Ты должен подчиниться мне или уйти». «В таком случае мне остается только уйти», — сказал маленький человек.
В Одессе, в Украине мне было очень приятно. Но это было другое чувство. Это не чувство Родины, а это просто, как римские каникулы, да? Вот это место, где мне очень нравилось жить. Вот. Но это не Родина. Родина у меня только здесь. Это необъяснимое такое вот чувство, наверное, как и любая такая настоящая любовь. Вот я не могу себе представить себя без, например, вот этого побережья. И без того, что я там летом не пойду купаться на море.
Прошли годы, и маленький человек начал скучать по морю, по деревьям, по горам, по родному языку, по улицам, на которых он вырос. И он решил вернуться домой. Сын маленького человека, который жил далеко, узнал об этой встрече и решил помочь своему отцу разбудить время. Собирать истории, из которых слагаются песни. Так сын маленького человека стал трубадуром.
Not the film yet, but already beautiful material, if you ask me. The beautiful quotes.
Very good cameraman.
And a great cameraman. I mean, we can't wait to see it, of course, when it's finished. Because there's this word homeland in there already. That is something like love. How do you define it? So already some beautiful questions it raises, or some, well, possible answers on the question you're asking yourself, or you try to document when you're going to be there. How do you going to do it from April on when you start shooting?
I mean, how I came to this is actually, like I said before, it's very hard. Such a abstract theoretical question like what is a country? It's like you said, there's no answer to that. So
there's many answers.
There's
to it.
many. Yes, exactly. There's many answers to it. So when I started to do my research, I read a lot, and there's many different, without, now going into it too much, but there's many different theories about how people came together and how countries were formed. Roughly, from what I read, is that you have, of course, there's this theory that the moment that people started to settle down, and they needed to cooperate. That was when people were depending on each other, that was actually the moment when something like a community that could be called the beginning of a country was established. Then there's also the theory that when a group of people can't know each other personally, when the group of people is too big to know every person in that group, when it's too big, you need other ways to formalize that those people are belonging together. And there's another theory that basically the form of a country really started to become more concrete. Is like, let's say, in mid of the 19th century, when countries, or when the land, including its inhabitants, was not the possession of a king or whatever.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution.
Precies, yeah, exactly. It's more or less simultaneous with the Industrial Revolution. However, having read all those books and thought about it, etc., I wasn't still close to what I wanted to do, but it sort of, tunneled my thoughts. And then I thought, I'm not so interested in the formal side of what a country is, like in borders or in all these things, but I'm much more interested in what makes, for instance, people die for their nation. That's a big thing, when you put the nation over the value of your own life, or why people feel homesick. What is that? What makes that is so important?
But because you immediately make a very interesting. You switch now from language to nation rather than country, which I think is also crucial, because nation is not necessarily the same with country.
Yes,
which is what you see when there's conflict over what a country.
Yes, there's a lot of discussion also. What is a nation? What is a country? Etc. That's of course. And I wanted to sort of bypass those kind of questions, and in a way you could also say that I'm much more interested in this kind of national identity that people have. That can actually lead to wars, that can, has a lot of effects on the bigger form of what a country is or a nation is. So to keep this story, not to keep it a bit short, what I sort of decided that there was there's a French philosopher who wrote a wonderful, he was a bit of a right-wing bastard, but nevertheless he wrote a good article in late 19th century about what is a country. And one of the things that he is saying is that it's really what binds people from one generation to another. So it has to do with tradition, but tradition in the sense of what I have been told by my grandfather, the stories I have been told by my grandfather, and I feel that is where I'm part of it, and in such a way that I want to retell those stories to my children, that is actually something which is very much outside all the formal, the whole formal side of this. And that's how I came to culture, because culture is something that, you know, whether it's dance or music or books or writing, language has to do with it, religion has to do with it. That I found much more interesting. So what I did is, when I came to Abkhazia, which has this multi-ethnical, you know, there's more Armenians at the moment living in Abkhazia than Abkhazians. There's Greek living there. There's even Syrians, which is very interesting to tell you this little anecdote about the Syrians that are there.
Yeah, that's a new group of Syrians.
Yeah, that's a new group of
newly
Syrians.
arrived. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Whereas Georgians, Russia doesn't allow, as you probably know, any refugees, but there are Syrians in Abkhazia. Why, I will maybe tell you a little bit later. So that's how I came to Sipa, Sipa Labahua, who is an artist. And actually what is quite interesting, if you look at it, there's, you know, in the photographs, you see that, like I was saying before, the war is omnipresent in Abkhazia. It is as if the war is binding the people. It's the thing that binds all these people. It's not religion, because there's Muslims, there's Christians, there's pagans, there's non-believers. You know, there's it doesn't have any. But the war is the thing that, you know, there was a war in 92, 93, and that's it devastated the country. It was, you know, like a Pyrrhic victory, but that war is something which is omnipresent. So everything in the country that is an expression of culture is related to the war. War monuments, war songs, war films, medals. You know, this is very important for people. And Sipa, his own life story is very interesting. But what he did, he put up the first statue that had nothing to do with the war, which is the little boy. There's a statue of a little boy somewhere.
We'll see it later. Yeah.
Who is the main character of? He's called Chik. And it's the main character of Fazıl Iskander's. Fazıl Iskander was a Abkhazian writer who won the Nobel Prize of Literature. And the Chik was the main character. So it was something that was related to Abkhazia, but not related to the war. And that suddenly sort of arose a lot of discussion, but also a lot of emotions with a lot of people in Abkhazia. Yeah. So that's how we got to know each other. Okay. And then his own life story is very interesting. He's one of the things next to statues and, you know, like sculptures and what he's doing is he's also making one-man marionette theaters. And what you saw in the clip is a marionette theater that for which we wrote the text together, which is about what is a country, but also about his own story, because he was born in Abkhazia, he grew up in Tbilisi, and in the end he became an artist in Moscow. And when he was about to break through as an artist, he came back to Abkhazia again. That was suddenly a country and not a republic within the Soviet Republic of Georgia. So that's that. I started to work together with him. So what the film is going to be is we're going to travel around with this little theater around the country, visiting different communities, the Abkhazians, the Armenian Abkhazians, the Greek Abkhazians, Russians who, very interesting story as well, Russians who moved out of Moscow, leaving Moscow behind and resettling on land that you can touch. And if you ask them, what is your country? They say they just take a hand of soil and they say, this is my country because this is feeding my family. But they're actually Russians. Anyway, so there's many different you know, like people that I will ask this question, but it's kind of fueled by the marionette show that is traveling around.
Okay. And what's so interesting, Marieke, is that Ineke says, I'm interested in the culture, in the identity, and it shows in many ways, the religion, the language, etc., etc. But I think in your work in international law, I mean, identity are also parts, I think, of the narrative of why they come to you because they think of constituting a country. Or could you tell something about your clients or you work with, and why I think maybe some of these aspects are also relevant for the claim of we want to be a country, and that's why you work with them, no?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think
Tell us something about that.
Yeah, so I'm a little confused now because I was like, because I thought your question was going to go somewhere else, and now I'm like,
sorry,
I want to say, no, I want
Is that a
to
good
also,
question?
no, I want to also say something about how law treats that identity question.
Sure.
But indeed, before we go there, these questions of identity, I think you describe it very well. They're very emotional, and what you see is that you also mentioned sort of both of you, the common enemy aspect to it, and that really interests me. That what you very often see happening among people, but definitely is also something that political leaders can use and very often do, is to create sort of a sense of identity by creating a common enemy, or not creating because it often is there, but at least using that narrative. And an enemy can be like really brutal, or it can be political, and that's also something that you see, for instance, occurring in Spain with Catalonia. It's not a client, but I find it really interesting to see that how sort of when we, from a safe distance in the Netherlands, when we look at this situation, that you see more and more a situation where by actually using like law and very fierce language that they're wrong and you're going to arrest the leaders, what actually then happens is that you kind of generate or create a situation in which that identity becomes so easily to be mobilized. And people then sort of start getting the idea that there is only one way to go towards independence, and there's no way back. And this is what often happens in these what has happened usually over centuries, and I think that's also really
exactly what
interesting.
happened also in Abkhazia and in the whole of Georgia, actually.
And in more areas of the Caucasus, and I find the Caucasus so interesting because they, of course, in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet era, Russia was actively relocating all these people, and forbidding the local languages often, or at least creating Russia as the main language. So there's some really interesting aspects of identity in this area, and it's also, I think, what you see with Abkhazia, where you see in that conflict an ethnic cleansing that also very much occurred in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where both sides, like the Armenians and the Azeri, both sides were ethnically cleansing in the sense of not necessarily like slaughtering, like that happened too, but mostly by burning houses, by just pushing them out. So all sides commit crimes, like it's
that's clear.
way too complicated to
We're not
say.
taking sides.
And that's a different conversation. But what you do see is that it becomes dangerous, and especially in many conflicts over the world, what happens is that, especially after centuries and centuries, it's these emotions that make a group identify with each other, and it becomes dangerous when it is against and othering the others, becomes the enemy. Conflict, people kill each other, and then then all of the people find that there is no way out. And then how are you going to solve it?
But then there's the other story, that you want recognition, you want to be defined by yourself and not by, well, the enemy you had or the country you were part of. So I guess this narrative is needed to actually claim that you are Catalonia or South Sudan or whatever.
And in a way, this might be like jumping all the way, but in a way you also see this a little bit in the discussion around Brexit, right? Like there's this idea of, it's like the Europeans, it's too far, it's too distant, like they're taking our money, and some of these things are right, and some of these things are really not true, but it becomes a narrative in which it's kind of easy to say, you know, it's them that are against us, and I thought one of the really interesting aspects is when you saw also in interviews and documentaries, interviews with, like, for instance, farmers in the UK, and the people asked them, like, Dutch journalists, just with the complete Dutch economist efficient view, right? But don't you realize that you're going to lose money over this? And they're just looking shocked and appalled to the interviewers, like,
who cares?
Yes, but we don't care, because there's
exactly.
something way more important.
Yeah.
And that's what you see in Abkhazia as well. That's what you see in Catalonia. That's what you see in all these conflicts. And looking through the economic lens very often misses the point that these
It sounds like a bridge for Leon, and then I come to you for a comment or a question. Yeah.
I would advise the British not to be too optimistic of the pressure that German car makers can push on the German government to get a favorable treatment. But they will pay an economic price. But of course, these farmers will say we are prepared to pay this for this false optimism about sovereignty. On the other hand, Europeans are also prepared to pay a price to put the British on in their place, I would say. So, it works both ways.
Yeah. So actually, on both sides, it's more an emotional.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
And I think Brexit, it is also a thing about migration, and Polish influx in Great Britain has played a negative role there.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that most member countries were allowed to put hindrance. You didn't have to allow immediately a free movement of people, but the British government then, under Tony Blair, was pretty in the capitalistic spirit, said, "Oh, that's no problem. It's no problem for the UK. So please come here." And of course, it's beneficial from a narrow economic point of view to pursue this. And then another element, which I also think interesting, is what keeps the US together, because there you have you could argue great solidarity among the states. Of course, it is crumbling a bit. I mean, Trump won't visit California. And so it is not really, it cannot really be ruled out, I would say, under present circumstances, that you could get separatism in California.
Okay, California is seceding from the United States. Okay.
But yeah, really, we think that is unthinkable because you are an American and we pay up. If there are any problems, then you pay up. But I think there's also in the US that's very important. I mean, you have a banking union, and you have federal money going to states who suffer. And if the real estate market in Florida would collapse, then the federal government will step in.
Yeah.
So the US taxpayer will pay up for the poor, suffering people the good people of Florida. That's all true, of course, but there is also a huge tolerance of, I would say, domestic migration. Yeah. So if there are regions in the US who are doing badly, then people will move on. And there is very little resistance against this movement of people around the US. So there's an important element. Language helps, of course, but I also think that's an important cultural aspect.
But it's interesting that from the European Union perspective, that the economy is fueling actually this discussion about what's a country, do we feel safe in a country, et cetera, like what Brexit is doing. I mean, by having more migration, which is good for the economy, in the end, people were like, well, this is not the country that we want to be part of.
But you're already assuming what is good for the country. So you're already assuming what is economically good.
Economic perspective, yeah. Well,
it's a value statement, of course.
Yeah, what do you think on that?
No, that's true. There are then cultural barriers, and of course also the every country has tensions, of course. So it's always difficult to see what really is the tipping point. I mean, London is of course very different from the rest of the UK. And you have the same tendencies in the US, where you have the cities on both coasts with a much different worldview than what they then call there the flyover people. So the more agricultural states. So there are tensions, but there are also tensions in Germany. I mean, the rich Bavarians, they don't want to pay up for the Italians, but they also don't want to pay up for for Berlin. I mean, Bavaria was the only German state who voted against the German constitution in 1948 because they found it too centralized. But of course, you had a qualified majority, so Bavaria had to be a member of the Federal Republic of Germany. But even in this highly developed, rich countries, you have these kind of tensions, which can come to the surface, and it's all very difficult to predict or to assess.
Okay.
I think that's also one thing that we really need to be aware of, that it's not something that only happens in Africa. Like it can happen all the time. We need to be much more careful and not so naive that we're beyond any human conflict.
Catalonia or Abkhazia are still pretty close by.
And I think
let's go to do we have a microphone, or the microphone is coming, so we can. It's for the stream and for the recording. Here we go.
Yeah, hi. That's great you're just mentioning this. I thought it was very interesting what Marieke said about creating a sense of identity by creating an enemy or an other, a sense of otherness. And I only wanted to add that I think you made it sound a little bit like it's something happening in other countries, but I think it's very happening in Netherlands as well, with creating a sense of otherness with people who don't agree with Black Pete, for example, or are members of an elite, or are Islam radicals, so-called, like they're all radicals, or even immigrants. Like it's something very alive, and I think also a bit of alarming, because probably we're not so sure of ourselves anymore, that we need this other. Can you say anything about where you think that comes from?
Yeah.
Well, let's go. Marieke first and Ineke, yeah?
There's multiple really interesting aspects that you raise. Where that comes from, I feel that there is indeed sometimes a laziness, and I think for me, I connect it to maybe the 90s, particularly as sort of an era in which we became so optimistic and at the same time so blind, therefore, of the fact that we are humans, we are different, and so we disagree. And in order to live together, we will always have to work very hard, and we always have to be aware of the fact that there's others, and that doesn't mean that they're wrong, but they're different. And so in order to do that, we need to always be aware of testing our own assumptions, be open to allowing that testing. And I think what has, for me, happened, if we look at the recent history, in the 90s particularly, is this idea that you can overcome that, what we call in Dutch the maakbare samenleving, like that there's like a formula, and if you do better, that you can find almost utopia, the perfect world. And it's a language that we've chosen, opted, that I think is very, it combines a couple of like languages, but in the sense of assumption. So it's very economically driven, very much focused on efficiency. It's very liberal. It's also very neoliberal. It's very legalist. So the idea, and proceduralized. So the idea that laws come to solutions, answers, yes or no. It's like a machine-driven idea, and humans aren't machines, and society isn't. So I think if you look at human history, what there's always been is this idea, on the one hand, of the individual and the importance of self-employing, like self-development as an individual, and just as importantly, the social, the interaction. Humans can't live by it themselves. So that tension inherently, I think, has always been and will always be, but we kind of forget that. And part of what I think is also concerning, worrying in our Western societies connected to it is, I'm not a religious person, but religion really fulfills certain very important societal aspects that I think through secularization we have lost. And our education system very much, for instance, is very much focused on the individual, because the social was catered elsewhere in society. And by increasing that individualization in society, I think we are sort of losing the ability in the last couple of decades of actually understanding what the other and therefore the contesting of own assumptions are.
Is it not in a way that nowadays everybody is different and that makes us have to discuss what binds us together again in a new way?
Yeah, and so
that's what you're saying
exactly,
also. Like we have to create a space like education to make sure that people
and my point
understand
would
each other.
mostly be there's nothing new in it. The only new is that we might have forgotten what we have always known to be a struggle. And if you forget, that becomes super dangerous because then you get societal conflict. Now, another thing that I find really interesting, and that sort of brings it back to our topic of statehood, the difference between what we are now seeing in the Netherlands and these conflicts which lead to conflict and secession and that kind of stuff, is that one really crucial aspect in these discussions is territoriality. So what I said before, like, oh, that identity question is also really interesting if you look at how law treats that. So there's been a case in Canada on Quebec where this became for the Supreme Court of Canada, this question of the Quebecois saying, we want independence. And so then the lawyers, judges, needed to decide over what actually does the law say about that. And you saw an incredible, and it's really fascinating to read with this lens, like you saw like this reluctance of saying anything because you just felt the difficulty of judges saying, but law and these identity questions. And so what did they do? They worked very hard to not say too much. So for instance, on the question of what constitutes a people, because then they sort of like, okay, so if you ask independence, then you have to answer what is a country, then you have to answer like who then is that who is entitled to that rights, because the rights connects to entities, and international law knows how to, at least before then, knows how to deal with states, but you know what, like individuals, peoples, what the hell are they, right? They're not really subjects of international law. At least they weren't. In the last couple of decades, that has increasingly become that. So after Second World War, mostly human rights came, and then with decolonization, there's this idea of peoples. So more recently, in this case in Canada, they're like, okay, so we see that international law entitles non-state parties, individuals, and people's rights, but what are they? Okay, so what's a people? And then you see them. You know, a couple of these aspects, you're like, okay, so what are the objective criteria of a people? And you see them, right, language, culture, religion, and then you see them, and a bunch other probably, and then you also see them, but that's not to say that if there's multiple religions that it's not a people, or if they have the same religion as others that it's not anyway. And the same with, so basically what they said is, there are objective criteria, and they're like this, but we're not saying anything about anything. So that was one objective criteria. Then the subjective criteria. They said definitely what constitutes a people having the right to form a country, potentially, also requires subjective criteria, meaning they need to be feeling a people. They need to be themselves identifying as a people. So if you, and that's also something that you need to be objectively seeing. So if there's no self-identification as a people, then you also don't. And then the third, and that is territorial. So they also connected saying there needs to be an identifiable territory that these people claim as their territory. So that is also, of course, interesting with the discussions around the Roma, nomad people. So that they exclude that as well.
The Kurdish people.
The Kurdish,
well, they claim an area. So that's you see that law and lawyers, lawyers depend. Judges find it really hard because judges are the ones that have to say yes and no, and they're like, ooh. And lawyers, they embrace it in the sense of like, if you can argue one or the other side, then the law gives you so much.
That's great stuff.
Because you can argue one and the other, and there's a bunch more law. Cool. If you want to know.
Ineke?
To come back to Karin's question, I think that yes, a common enemy. It's something that appears in all kinds of forms, and the reason why I think I agree with you very much, but I think it's also that we're living in a very, very, very confusing time. The world is getting much smaller and much bigger at the same time. and the definition of where we belong also becomes very, very complicated. You know, if there's a community on the internet, or when the UEFA is maybe also a kind of a country, it's very, very hard for people to all become internationalists, of everybody becoming a world citizen. It's impossible. A lot of people feel that the natural belonging of home is giving them a security in life, and this security is shaking at the moment, and that's making that people are clinging to certain things, whether it's Zwarte Piet or whether it's you know, like a language or particular folk songs or whatever. You know, that's I think that the big turning point on which the world is standing is also creating that people are, you know, backing off and holding on to what they know.
Yeah, but Leon, from an economic perspective, it is sometimes maybe frustrating because they are voting or behaving against their own economic interests, you could sometimes say. How do you deal with that? Is that something you have to calculate in? How do you try to make an analysis based on decisions you have to make when it comes to investments or...
Yeah, well, that's true, of course. I mean, an interesting case is Scotland, because yeah, you could argue linguistic reasons, perhaps economic in a way, that they wanted to separate themselves. They had their own banking notes, so there is a kind of idea of a separate Scottish culture. But in an economically, it didn't make much sense now because they're heavily dependent on oil. And then they also made a mistake that they said, well, we keep, for security reasons, we keep the pound. But it's very strange. If you then decide to separate yourself from the UK, and you are heavily dependent on oil, then it's insane that you don't introduce your own currency. So if the oil price collapses, which it did, then of course you are a bit protected. You make your currency cheaper, and it's easier to survive in a difficult world. So, but okay, people act against their narrow economic interests. Of course, that's I mean, that's how humans are. But I also think there's here in Western Europe there's also a sense of it's a bit of a luxury. I mean, it isn't really necessary, for instance, to keep Spain as a whole. I mean, if you speak to a Spaniard, he would say Spain doesn't exist. You have the Basque region, you have Navarra, you have Catalonia. It's not only separatism in Catalonia. I mean, there's little which keeps this whole Spain together. And then I agree with you, if you don't have an enemy, then it's very easy to say, well, everyone for his own, why not? It's kind of luxury. And then in Catalonia, the only argument then you can say, if you would go your own way, you are not anymore a member of the EU, you are not a member of NATO, so it's pretty cold outside. And on the other hand, European pragmatism would also say, yeah, you shouldn't wait too long to make some arrangements for Catalonia because you can't accept this hole on the European map, and the same is for Scotland, of course. I mean, if an independent Scotland would leave NATO, that's a disaster, of course. So you should arrange something. Sorry?
Friesland.
Yes. Lucky that the gas is in Groningen, not in Frisia. Otherwise, we would have our own separatist movements, I suppose.
Let's go from Friesland back to Abkhazia, because Marieke, what's the current status of Abkhazia from an international law perspective?
Well, so if you ask a lawyer, then the lawyer in me says, well, which kind of law will I use? In the sense of, we have this a convention in 1933 in Montevideo. And they said the states, and it's customary international law, and they said, okay, what constitutes a country? And so they answered to say it needs to be there needs to be a population. And so if you look at Abkhazia, like check, right? Yep. There needs to be territory, check. and there needs to be a government check that has the ability to interact internationally, engage with other states. So it's a bit vague, but you'd say they want to, etc. So does that mean that therefore, if you put it in the machina of international law, the answer is yes, it's a country? No. Why? Because it just doesn't. That's not illegal. Because then you kind of like, no, but they're part of another sovereign state, Georgia. So you shouldn't look at whether it constitutes a country. No, you need to look at whether they have the right to secede. Okay, so then we go back to that Quebec case, because they had to answer that question, and in the end they ruled that Quebec did not have a right to secede. And this is also a way that you can look at Catalonia, where they said, well, yes, people, so if you say that constitute people, then they have a right to self-determination. What does that mean? And then they say, well, there's internal self-determination that everyone has a right to, and there's external self-determination that only applies in certain circumstances. So internal self-determination is the right, so that Abkhaz have, to execute their own, sort of to be themselves. So economic, culturally, speak their language, and that kind of stuff. So what then the case on Quebec said is kind of like, well, you have like a political representation, you can speak your language, you can do your own little, legal system and all that. So you have the requirements of fulfilling your internal self-determination are fulfilled. End of story. They said a little bit more, so that's what we then need to look into. What does that mean? When do you have the right to external self-determination? So to actually secede from the existing state, so from Georgia. And then they say, well, there is 2 and maybe 3 situations in which that can occur, and that is one, decolonization. So if you are a colonial entity, then you have the right to secede. If you look at Abkhazia, no. That's not what they mean with colonial.
But
no,
even Soviet Union is not.
There are different. No. There are different opinions about.
Yeah, but legally there's not.
Okay,
so legally,
interesting.
Because that's the second one. So the way that it sort of that category, the colonial, is really like they call it the salt water criteria. So it's mostly focused on the 60s, etc. But then we've got the second criterion. Then it becomes super vague, because then they say you also have the right to secede if you are subjected to, or if you are a victim of alien subjugation. And no one knows what that means, and there's never been case law. So what people speculate is that it has something to do with Palestinian situation. People also sort of have that in mind when they look at Bangladesh, like how that sort of, but that was an agreement. So, but then the interesting thing, that probably doesn't apply to here as well, for all sorts of reasons. But then it becomes the one that everyone talks about, speculates about, and that, for instance, the Kosovo situation was all about. And that is something that might be a right or might not be a right. And this is what judges then do if they don't want to say anything about it. They say, even if that would exist, it doesn't apply now, so we're not going to talk about it. So we don't know. But the idea is that maybe there's also a right if your human rights are violated in some severe manner. How severe? And then if that, if there's real crimes being committed against you, then you have a right to secede. So now this, particularly because it is so open, everyone is using. So all the situations in the world where there's a conflict and therefore violence and therefore human rights violations, they then say, we have this right. So first of all, we don't know whether the right exists, and second of all, we don't know when then that right applies. But if we look at then, through that lens to Abkhazia, I don't think they have a really great case either. So, and that also goes for Catalonia. So then you can say, okay, so they don't have a right to secede. So law says no, no. Because then comes a very different question, and you'd say, how is this possible because it's law? So then comes, if you ask the International Court of Justice a different question, what they posed with the Kosovo situation, not does Kosovo have the right to secede? Because then, well, some states say, well, the human rights violations, like the Netherlands, human rights violations were so severe, Netherlands said, yes, they have a right to secede. But what the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, actually answers was a different question. That is it forbidden, is it prohibited in international law to declare independence? This becomes a super interesting one for Catalonia, because what the International Court of Justice said is there is nothing in international law that prohibits a declaration of independence. Every entity has the right to independence, and they can do referenda to see, whether people want independence. So in that sense, if you then look at through that kind of legal decisions to Abkhazia, you'd say, well, you know, if they declare independence, they have a right to do so.
Okay.
But in the case,
yeah.
just a question.
And if you have any questions, comments, please raise your hand.
In the case of Abkhazia, within the Soviet Union,
Yes.
there were several republics, and Abkhazia was an independent, how to translate this in English, I don't know, it was like a sub-republic. And when Georgia has declared independence from the Soviet Union, they also declared independence. So it goes back to their old rights, their old claims. So we were a country, we're not becoming a new country, we are an old country, and we want to remain an old country. So how does
that's exact. So there, I need to.
Very complicated, isn't it?
No, because it's actually it's complicated, but at the same time it's so simple because it's politics. So what you then see is that all this law, and there's an important one that I forgot. So let me get back to that in a second, and that is what happens when another state starts messing with it. So and then everything changes again. So, but one sec. First, this. Here what you see is, yes, you see multiple entities declare independence, and why was that not recognized, the independence of Abkhazia, and why was the Georgian one recognized? I don't know, but the fact that that occurred, that it was Georgia, including Abkhazia, that was recognized, that means that makes all the difference.
Recognized by other countries, you mean?
Recognition.
Yeah.
So what you see is that there's all these legal rules, and in short, on that aspect, what happens when another state interferes, what the law says is that all of this, what I just said, is all true, and then they say, comma, but you cannot, another state cannot interfere with that, because that's violation of international law, because it's interference with the internal affairs of another state, is a violation of international law, and a new state cannot come into constitution if that happens while international law is violated.
Okay.
So violence, use of force is prohibited, other states can't interfere with it, and then of course comes the question, well, what is interference? Because if you recognize a state, and that constitutes then the independence, which law says it's only declarative, like the independence exists and then you recognize. In reality, that's not the case. Why is Kosovo a functioning independent state, more or less? Because I think at 111 or 114, many states have recognized it.
Yeah, which for the case of Abkhazia, it's Russia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Nauru.
And Nauru,
so
and I also...
big country,
who then got a huge
that
amount
was
of
only
money.
after 15 years of nobody recognizing them. Eh?
Yeah, so it was very late. Some countries were...
Only after 2008, when there was the war with Georgia, that's when when Russia first and then...
and then allies of Russia, I would say, Venezuela, Nicaragua,
and what is really difficult, I think, for the viability, the political and legal viability of Abkhazia and Crimea is the role of Russia there. Because what is interference, recognition, you can even argue, but what has Russia done, especially in 2008, is, at least I've never been, and I'm not an expert, so I might be wrong, and because everyone has an interest, so this is the war of information. But at least what I believe has happened is that they have given wildly and widely passports to Russian passports to people in Abkhazia, and then has said,
and Ossetia.
Yeah, and Ossetia, and then they've said, well, these are Russian nationals, so we have the obligation as the mother state of our nationals to protect them from human rights violations, which is of course very clever. But really, like, if it would come for a court, like, how's a judge going to look at that? Okay. But it won't come.
Leon, let's look through the economic perspective. What's the economical? Is there economical reasoning behind the state of Abkhazia? Is it economically viable in your perspective?
Oh yeah, in theory it is, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Any state with any kind of population is in potentially
Monaco doing quite well. So
tax haven.
And there you have the nice climate, and as you've seen, it's tragic to see that this was the Russian Riviera and it is completely destroyed. And I've never been there, but I would have expected, that's near Sochi, that the Russians would have put more money in it. I read that. Population is perhaps 250, a quarter of a million. Yeah. And
less.
A bit less, but the Russian state has sent their civil servants also to Abkhazia, I believe 1 million, as tourists. So you would expect to see a bit more. If I look to the film, it's very disappointing how it's now looking. But in theory, of course, this region would have to be able to live by tourism easily.
There's a very practical, it is very interesting. I know very little about politics, but I know that there's a big debate about being able to buy land and real estate in Abkhazia. It's forbidden for anybody who doesn't hold the Abkhazian nationality unless you marry an Abkhazian. So my husband, who's sitting here, wanted to divorce me and marry an Abkhazian woman to be able to, and that's yeah, exactly.
Even better. Wow,
yes,
the perfect deal.
Yeah.
I would also guess that the general problem there is that property rights aren't well protected.
No, there is a lot of empty houses that actually are claimed by Georgians Georgian Abkhazians actually, who fled or who left the country or whatever. So it's very, very complicated, to whom belongs what.
It's a tragedy because it. After the disintegration of the Russian Empire, Soviet Empire, Georgia did well. It had tremendous rates of growth, but then the war started and economy collapsed, and nothing much is happening since. So in a way, it's you could say it's a tragedy because potential of the
2018. Everybody recommends to go to Georgia. It's on a hot list of countries to visit. So maybe
Bies de Mol is in Tbilisi.
Bies de Mol is there. A Dutch TV program.
But can you just travel to Abkhazia then? Can Abkhazia benefit from?
It isn't recommended by the Dutch government.
Exactly.
Well.
But it's also, and that's the sad story of these people, right? Because the people, they're not the politicians, and they're the ones that are suffering because it's a conflict, because indeed it is difficult to go there and travel, to invest potentially, because you don't have the security that you have in countries that are recognized by other states.
Well, it's that, and Leon, lack of recognition is probably also economically very hampering for investment, no? I mean, do you feel comfortable investing in countries which are not officially recognized? Is that a normal...
I think the rule of law is important, of course. If your property rights are not protected, that makes it then unattractive. So I think you have a point there.
Yeah.
So nobody recognizes the region, and property rights aren't guaranteed, so it's difficult. But of course, if you are protected by the Russian Federation, in principle, that must open opportunities.
Yeah, it helps.
But it helps, but... it's a powerful state, but now strangely, also the Russians aren't apparently not doing much to improve.
No, there's I heard a very interesting thing about the Russians and the position of the Russians in Abkhazia is, we have the territory, you can have the country. Literally, and that's a very interesting one because it's basically a political buffer zone to, like you said before, to disable Georgia to become a candidate for NATO citizenship, NATO membership, and it's a buffer zone. It's full. It's very interesting. When you cross the border between Georgia and Abkhazia. By the way, you can, if you want to go there, it's no problem. You just go to the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You fill in an application for a visa. You get it sent back within a week, and then you can go to the border. You first have to go through the Georgian border, who are saying that they're not a border because there's no border.
Officially, it's Georgia, right? Funny.
Yeah. Then you have to go through
the security zone, probably.
Yes, exactly. There's this photo of this very, very long bridge with horse carts.
Yeah,
that's the Abkhazian-Georgian border.
Okay, yeah.
In Azerbaijan, they call it the line of contact.
Yes, yeah,
that's
exactly.
Beautiful.
But what is interesting about this border is that the Russian so-called blue helmets, or you know, like they're acting like protection. They are the worst of the three borders to get through. It's the most difficult one to cross. So you first have the Georgians, then the Abkhazians. They just call to Sukhumi, you know, to say, did we give a visa to these guys? Yes, okay, you can go. And then the Russians are coming, and they're really old-fashioned, you know, like Soviet discipline of, you know,
sometimes some things never change. Yeah. Okay, but it would be a nice summer holiday visit. Yes. It's. I think it's time to wrap up, because we'll never have the final answer of what constitutes a country. But Marieke, from your perspective, are we going to see how countries evolving in something else? I mean, we see the rise of the city-state. We see that there's more migration going on. Also, as Ineke says, is maybe the country getting a strange continent in the 21st century, or do you think it's the opposite? I mean, we see more and more countries popping up.
So I don't know, because I think that is a very what we definitely see is that the concept of the sovereign state that is a fairly recent invention, only a few centuries, as you said. Globalization is contesting that in all ways, and at the same time we see, as we discussed before, you see that humans also need the direct contact. They need to have the polis, so the people, they need to have some sort of connection with their politics. So doing away of the nation state, it's not that easy. We can't just be a globe. But I think more importantly, because I can't speculate, but definitely it's intention. But I think what I do really want to sort of wrap this up with from my end is the going back to the humans. I see here meet the humans of the planet that are involved in these tragic situations, because for them these situations, I don't really see them going anywhere. And that is the sad story, because this is high geopolitics. There are states that are fighting their proxy wars over these situations. It is going nowhere, because the law can say so many things, but there's no judges to actually rule on them, because international law, international conflicts rarely have a courtroom that has jurisdiction. But more importantly, even if there are rulings, the geopolitics rarely actually do anything with that. So it is geopolitics, it is internal politics that is, you know, the only way. And that is something that I find so tragic about the Spanish situation, because you see it unfolding, you see it escalating in front of our eyes, using law, using the legal language, like Rajoy did mostly. And that's not saying that I think that Puigdemont is a hero or pro-independent or anything like that. But just looking at what Madrid does in this situation, is using law, like invoking the Constitution, and therefore the answer is it's forbidden, which international law doesn't say, right? Independence is not prohibited. But by saying that and by having that, you know, court ruling and arresting, whatever you can say about the law, first of all, it's not going to give you the answer, because the people are not going to then say, like, oh, you know what? If you put it that way, we do want to live together with you. It's highly fueling. It is dangerous. It is stupid. This is not how humans work. This is not how society works. What you need is a political solution. That is extremely difficult, but it's definitely not what this situation is escalating into. They need to sit together. They need to have a constructive dialogue. They need to come with some sort of a solution, and that solution is not provided by law, because law can mediate when there are sort of clarities somewhere behind there, and you just have a conflict on that interpretation. Law doesn't say about these inherently political issues. Law does not provide that answer, and it's really important to realize, and also to really continue to realize that for these people that are facing in these conflicts, it is never going anywhere. Look at how long this Abkhazia situation is existing, like Nagorno-Karabakh, South Sudan, is an independent state, not going that great. No. Kosovo, you know, everyone supports it, but at the same time, you know, it's so hard for them to exist. So tragic.
Okay. Leon, also for you, kind of the same question. I mean, it's change paradox. In many parts of the planet, people are stuck. On the other hand, capital is flowing freely all the time and more digital as ever. That's also fascinating, right? How do as countries or nations, depending on the definition, control also this global connectedness?
Well, yeah, there is, in a sense, you see now perhaps the beginning of a trend of deglobalization. We have had periods in history after German unification till First World War with freely floating capital, and of course that could end. There could be, you could see a rise of borders and more control of capital. That's possible. It's hard to say. But in any case, I would say a bit modestly, European Union at the moment is doing quite well. And of course, they silently are perhaps applauding Trump and Putin, which helps to get the noses in the same direction over here, for the time being in any case.
Ineke, you start in April, right, with filming. Good luck, of course, but how are you going to start? What happens when you arrive there?
Oh, that's, as Sipa says, we are in a dark forest. We don't know where we are going, but we are together. That's his, and I'm very, I shouldn't be saying this actually in the microphone, but I'm very, let's say, surprised that all the funds and televisions they support us in this. We don't know where we are going. But no, I mean it's we'll see. I mean it's an adventure, and we'll be visiting many different people. Amongst them, also the Syrian refugees who live there. And yeah,
have a great adventure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leon, Ineke, and Marieke. And thank you. And let's have some drinks downstairs to further discuss what constitutes a country. Yeah.
Well, then you can tell us what constitutes a country for you.
Exactly. Yeah.